In 1916, the British Empire was embroiled in a war stretching from the mud and blood of Flanders to the deserts of Namibia against some of the most powerful states in the world. The threat posed by the Central Powers' desire to remold the shape of Europe in their favour was seen as critical, yet trouble simmered near the heart of the empire. In April 1916, Dublin became the site of a major revolt which sent shockwaves across the United Kingdom and proved that Germany wasn't the only enemy. Vicious fighting occurred through the streets of Ireland's capital as volunteers fought under the banner of the newly proclaimed Irish Republic, with the aim of severing the country from Britain. But within a week, the biggest Irish rebellion since 1798 was ruthlessly crushed, marking the start of a bloody conflict that would last well beyond the First World War. In this video, we'll be taking a look at why the Easter Rising happened, its aims, and of course the question you all came for, why it ultimately failed to achieve its immediate goals. To fully understand the conditions leading up to the Rising, we need to take a trip back in time. Ireland had been within the sphere of England and then Britain since the Norman Conquest in 1169. Throughout the centuries, it had generally retained autonomy, but with greater parts of the country gradually coming under the control of English lords, with most of this occurring within the Pale, which was an area of land around Dublin. When Henry VIII created a whole new religion and launched the Reformation to get more wives, there was further impetus for English lords to seize land from the Catholic Irish, which would continue until, spoilers, Ireland would become semi-independent in 1922. Crazy, I know. Alongside these plans, swathes of land in the province of Ulster were parcelled out to Protestant Scottish and English settlers, sowing the seeds for the tensions between Northern Ireland and the Republic, which continue to this day. But Ireland was never fully integrated into the home Isles to the same extent that, say, Scotland or Wales was, and only became a proper part of the UK during the 1801 Act of Union. This isn't to say that Britain didn't exert control, as it did. Following the devastation of the Irish famine in the late 1840s, millions emigrated across the wider empire, and the Irish language, known as Gaeilge or Gaelic, was driven to only the remotest parts of the country, something that would always haunt Irish nationalists, with Padraig Pearse stating that a country without a language is a country without a soul. By the turn of the 20th century, Irish Catholics owned just a fraction of the total land available for agriculture, with the rest being a part of large plantations which were privately owned for the most part. These historical events, often portrayed as oppressive, would only be used by future clandestine organisations to fuel nationalist fervour. Over its history of foreign rule, Ireland was always an unusual entity. Never seen as a true part of the empire's heartland, the country was treated as a semi-colonial principality, where its inhabitants were both oppressed and played an important role in the bureaucracy and the management of the British Empire. Yet despite its apparent insignificance, Ireland always figured in the plans of Westminster. Over its years of subservience, the Irish had launched countless rebellions aiming to break British rule. In 1798, the United Irishmen, led by Wolfe Tone with help from the good old French, tried and failed to free Ireland. Robert Emmet tried the same in 1803 but met a similar fate. It's through these and many other rebellions that the British came to view Ireland as the soft underbelly of the British Isles. Interestingly, many of these rebellions were rarely seen as complete failures by Irish revolutionaries. Instead, they were romanticised, along with heroes of Irish legend such as Brian Boru and Fionn McCool, to solidify Irish nationalism and a sense of identity which had been suppressed for so long. By the early 1900s, it seems that the flames of revolt would once again surge across the Emerald Isle. But the decision to launch a rebellion didn't come instantly, and for that we have to look at a few decades past. In the latter half of the 19th century, solutions to what had become known as the Irish question had gained two dimensions. Organisations such as the Irish Republican Brotherhood and its American equivalent, the Fenian Brotherhood, and later Clan na Gael, were committed to securing independence through violence if necessary. The Constitutionalist movement, on the other hand, sought to introduce reform and secure better autonomy for Ireland by working within the British system. This second movement was primarily led by Charles Stewart Parnell, an Irish nationalist who wished to introduce Home Rule. If Home Rule was passed, Ireland would be given autonomy within the British Empire, including its own parliament and the ability to make its own laws. Two attempts were made in the 1870s and 80s, but both failed, leaving a gaping hole in the constitutionalist movement that would last until the start of the First World War. In 1912, there would be a third attempt to introduce Home Rule, sparking what would become known as the Home Rule Crisis. A very imaginative name, I know. Not everyone in Ireland agreed with the prospect of Irish autonomy, and much of this contention came from the Unionists, based in Northern Ireland, which had a large Protestant and Presbyterian population. They believed that if given the opportunity, the Catholic populace would rise up and oppress them in revenge for centuries of persecution. So to fight Home Rule, they formed the Ulster Volunteers, a paramilitary force separate from the British Army which would be tasked with defending Ulster if the worst came about. In response, Irish nationalists set up the Irish Volunteers, real creative I know, also known as the IV, and soon both sides were engaged in weapon smuggling and gun running across the entire island. With rising tensions, Westminster was faced with a difficult choice. They could either rescind Home Rule and risk nationalist agitation, or proceed with the reforms and risk an uprising in Ulster, so they were basically fucked. But when a certain Austrian Archduke was shot by a Bosnian Serb in 1914, the threat of war provided a rare opportunity for the British Parliament to push Home Rule under the carpet, at least until this new war was won. As the government banned weapon imports to Ireland, the Irish Volunteers looked to other sources. With the onset of the war, the Volunteers contacted Germany, believing it would be a willing partner in helping to undermine British rule wherever it could. Roger Casement, an eminent diplomat and pioneer of human rights reporting, was placed in charge of the foreign mission. On the home front, the Republicans saw an opportunity to gain freedom from Britain with the start of the war, but a rift had started to develop. John Redmond, a prominent leader within the Irish Parliamentary Party, believed that volunteering for the Allied cause and creating Irish detachments within the British Army would ensure that Home Rule would be implemented after the war's end. This decision, to say the least, was very controversial, with many questioning why they had to fight and die for a country they didn't even care about. Other Republican leaders such as James Connolly, Eamon Keant and Patrick Pearse figured that with Britain distracted, a rare opportunity for an uprising had presented itself, one that likely wouldn't appear again. This rift within the Republican ranks separated the Irish Volunteers into two groups, with one group retaining the IV's name, and the other becoming the Irish National Volunteers, which followed Redmond. Many believed the classic "it'll be over by Christmas" and supported the decision to fight, but as the war dragged on, disillusionment became more common. In fact, a significant portion of the returning Irish soldiers would partake in the War of Independence and resulting civil war. Whilst the Irish Volunteers believed the time was ripe to revolt, they knew that the British far outmatched them in both men and guns. Efforts to cooperate with Germany had also been mixed. Even if they seemed receptive to sending weapons, it became apparent that the Germans would take advantage of any rebellion for their own ends. But the IV deemed any form of German intervention to be necessary if they were to ever secure Irish freedom. So on the 20th of November 1914, the Germans promised that any invasion of Ireland would be done so to liberate the country. And spoiler alert, it never happened, but it's interesting to think how things could have turned out otherwise. In April 1916, the Germans offered 20,000 rifles and 10 machine guns, but without any training, which disappointed the IV, who had expected a lot more. Nevertheless, they accepted the shipment, which was intercepted by the British before it could land. Oops. But support from the Irish diaspora, predominantly Irish Americans, was also important in gaining funds and weapons for the cause. For the British, it was a very convenient propaganda coup to associate any sort of Irish nationalism with a German conspiracy. Many pro-German elements were allegedly present in Sinn Féin, a nationalist political party founded by Arthur Griffith in 1905. Sinn Féin was a sort of nationalist boogeyman to the British, one that would haunt their rule over the next few years. In any case, deciding and planning an uprising were two different things. A decision had to be made. Would the uprising consist of a long-term guerrilla war, fought in the thick hedgerows of the Irish countryside, or would it be an urban rebellion, similar to the Paris Commune? Beyond that, the entire form of rebellion wasn't even agreed upon. Historian Charles Townshend states in his book, Easter 1916, that no universal plan existed for what a complete Irish uprising would look like. But regardless, with a fresh conscription crisis in 1915, a plan would eventually come together. Local detachments across the counties would be tasked with raiding local police barracks for weapons, whilst harassing and diverting any British troops. Joseph Plunkett, a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, was especially insistent on targeting Dublin. A follower of the Prussian theorist Clausewitz, Plunkett believed that the IV was strong enough to take and hold Dublin, with the bonus of defending it. Dublin had also been the centre of the 1803 rebellion led by Robert Emmet, which gave it an extra sense of significance. In preparation for a rising, the IV held exercises and marches, instilling a sense of patriotism amongst the volunteers. As for the date, Easter 1916 was chosen in part for its importance as the anniversary of the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, when the Vikings were driven from Ireland. News of a possible German offensive also meant that British troops would be drawn away, and they likely also wouldn't expect an uprising during the national holiday. But one decision by Chief of Staff Owen McNeill would seal the rising's fate before it even began. When he heard of plans to launch the rising during Easter week, he issued a countermanding order to all Irish volunteer units instructing them to demobilise. This really pissed off his fellow officers like Padraig Pearse, who had been adamant about staging an uprising in the first place. There are debates of whether the countermanding order truly doomed the uprising, or whether it was just one of many mistakes. Sure, it reduced the number of soldiers that could fight, but plans for the rising were far from uniform. Hell, even the decision to attack Dublin had basically been made at the last moment by Plunkett. But these issues aside, the Irish volunteers were ready come what may. On the 24th of April 1916, Plunkett, Connolly and many other leaders issued the Proclamation of the Irish Republic, officially ending its ties with the British Empire for the first time in centuries and sparking the flames of war. The leaders of the rising had expected the entire country to rise up with them, and it kinda didn't really happen. Many of the local units had simply gone home with the countermanding order, and those that remained were given contradictory orders from people that didn't really know what they were doing. Some local units, such as the Fingal Battalion based in northern County Dublin, took matters into their own hands, and scored some victories against the local Royal Irish Constabulary, seizing weapons and ammunition in what would become known as the Battle of Ashbourne. But such victories were few and far between. For others, the story was a bit different. For example, a unit in Cork barely participated, either due to poor communication or a quick response by the British, and would be investigated once Ireland had become independent. Overall, the rising outside of Dublin was sporadic at best, far from the all-Irish rising which Connolly and the gang had hoped for in the first place. In Dublin, the situation was different. With 1,200 volunteers, this was by far the largest force out of all units, divided between various battalions that were spread over the city. These were tasked with seizing communications offices, railways and other important buildings, apart from the seat of British control in Ireland, which was completely undefended. Yeah. They also failed to seize Trinity College, which would have served as an important garrison. Even with these immediate strategic blunders, the volunteers believed that the British wouldn't shell Dublin as it would alienate its inhabitants. But by the end of the week, the British would number over 16,000 with a lot of artillery. And with barely any weapons and plummeting morale, the leaders knew that chances of victory were minimal at best. Which brings us to the final question. Why did the Irish Rising fail? Well, it seems obvious. Overall, the Rising was characterised by several flaws. Its participants were poorly trained, poorly armed, and communication between units barely existed. Tactical blunders like occupying the wrong buildings or staying in the same location for the entire duration of the Rising were commonplace, and very few of the organisers even had military experience to say the least. But it's for those very reasons that the Rising is as significant as it is. Put simply, it was never intended to succeed. It was the first major rebellion against British rule since 1798 and the first instance of urban guerrilla warfare, the type that would become commonplace during the Spanish Civil War and beyond. Few expected the Rising to work, and yet they partook in it. For these men, it represented a valiant attempt at saving their national identity, to show that even if all the odds were stacked against them, Ireland would never kneel to England. That's not to say that the Rising is without controversy. Many decried it as a bloodthirsty attempt at warmongering, one that would force Ireland to devolve into violence and bloodshed for the next few years. After Connolly, Plunkett, Pearse and the rest were executed in the months following the Rising, anger against the British regime had begun to simmer amongst the general public. Support for Sinn Féin grew, and within 3 years, Ireland would fight its war of independence just as the leaders of 1916 had hoped. And now, more than 100 years later, the Rising holds a central place within the Irish national narrative, as an attempt to preserve Ireland's liberty in the face of an insurmountable foe. An embodiment of the fight for freedom. Hey, thanks for watching. If you're somehow still here, thank you for putting up with me all this time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, drop a comment, the usual stuff. This has been my longest video yet, and wow, I really enjoyed making it. Hard work? Definitely. A pain at times? Yep. But it's been a journey, and one that I've really enjoyed. Anyway, I'm Iravic, stay safe, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Two attempts were made in the 1880s and 70s, fuck's sake.